Hi, Rick. This is John Sakowitz. Welcome back to our show.
Always good to be with you, John. I love it. You got a great show. You got a great audience, and we got awful news. We're still in a train wreck.
Awful news. Come on.
So why don't you take it away? Why don't you give our listeners kind of a recap of the events in the last 24 hours, or maybe the overnight events, and then go forward with your analysis.
Well, what we've seen is what we expected. We've seen the Trump margins shrinking in Pennsylvania from about 460,000 at this time 24 hours ago down to about 120,000 now. So Biden has gained about 340,000 votes in the last 24 hours in Pennsylvania, and that will probably go on in the next 24 hours. The margin in Georgia has shrunk from about 50,000 to about 15,000, the Trump margin. So that one's very close. It's going to be very dicey. We've obviously seen Michigan and Wisconsin called for Biden. We see Biden's lead in Arizona holding. He's up by about 69,000. And we see Biden's lead very narrow in Nevada. It's a real problem. It's about 12,000. It was about 8,000 yesterday. So the picture is good. It certainly looks as though Biden is going to get to 270, and he may get as high as 300 electoral votes. Trump has to literally win everything that's out there in order to get to his 270 from where he is now, 214 electoral votes. So I think the prospects are good. But, John, I got to tell you, what troubles me as an observer and as a citizen is that we've been through a train wreck presidency for the last 4 years, and we're wounded, and the partisan polarization and the schisms in this country have generated a divided government that I'm not sure it can work. I mean, if Joe Biden makes it, he's going to face Mitch McConnell with a Republican majority in the Senate. Mitch has been difficult on court appointments. Apparently, he's already out with a statement saying Biden's got to pick moderate members of his cabinet. So Mitch is going to put his hands way into the way Joe Biden governs. Mitch dragged his heels all fall on a bailout package for the economy. I mean, this is going to leave people enormously unhappy. I mean, what we've created in this country with these red and blue warring camps, tribes, and this sharp, intense polarization is an unworkable situation. We've elected a government that can't govern, and that's a disaster. And, the president will get blamed for it, so Biden will get blamed for it. But we're not going to fix it because we're going to keep going through these divisions because we don't see either the Republicans in control of all three branches, the House, the Senate, and the White House, or the Democrats in control. So we can see one party and what it would do left to its own devices so we can actually make a judgment as a nation whether or not we want more of that or we want to switch. And we got this divided government. We got gridlock. It's just a mess. It's a tragedy. And actually, I wasn't going to do this, John, but I'm going to go back. I spent some time at Oxford. And you remember the great English historian Arnold Toynbee. And he studied the history of civilization, 6,000 years, 21 civilizations. And every civilization goes through what he called challenge and response. Every civilization faces some kind of challenge. And in ancient Egypt and in ancient the Inca civilization in Peru, it was actually the environment. Could they actually grow enough crops and support themselves, feed themselves, build cities, and actually survive as a civilization? Well, obviously they did that. We got the pyramids in Egypt. We got the temples at Machu Picchu. So they made it. Then the other threat that is most common is the threat of external military powers. And in the case of the Egyptians, they were conquered by the Ottoman Turks. In the case of the Incas, they were conquered by the Spaniards coming into South America. We as a nation have always managed to defeat the foreign outside military power that threatens us, whether it was Hitler's Germany in World War II, whether it was the World War I German power, or whether or not it was the Soviet Union and world communism. We've been able to deal with the military power. But the interesting thing that Toynbee tells us is the two civilizations that we most admire ancient Greece and ancient Rome. Both fell victim to what he called schisms in the body politic, internal divisions. That's what sank ancient Greece, and that's what sank ancient Rome. And that's what is killing America. It has been for the last 20, 25, 30 years, but it's getting worse. I mean, I can remember when I was a correspondent and I came to Washington in the 60s. I wasn't here for Eisenhower, but Eisenhower used to sit down and have brunch and bourbon with Lyndon Johnson when he was the majority of the Senate and Sam Rayburn was the Speaker of the House. The Republican president and the Democratic leaders of Congress sat down to see how they could work out doing the nation's business, even though they came from opposite parties. And Johnson did that when he became president with Everett McKinley Dirksen, who became the Senate Republican leader. We don't have that now.
So how do we? Let me ask you, Rick. Let me ask you, Rick. How do we get beyond tribal politics and identity politics? How do we break that deadlock?
Well, I'm not sure we know how, but I can tell you, at least looking at it from experience, the people who are going to be important in the next Senate are going to be Susan Collins of Maine, Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, Mitt Romney of Utah, maybe Rob Portman of Ohio. The question will be whether or not Joe Biden can reach across the aisle and on at least a few issues, economic recovery, dealing with the pandemic, maybe fixing Obamacare. So it's got some kind of Republican proposals in it, but it also fixes some of the flaws in the system. I think it's going to be individuals. And the only other thing that I can see that's hopeful is this crazy thing in the House called the Problem Solvers Caucus. It's 39 Democrats and 39 Republicans, and they've agreed to try to work, and they've been building this over the last 5, 6, 7 years, agreed to work for bipartisan solutions on everything. Now, they will produce things in the House. They'll produce legislation on Obamacare or on immigration reform or what have you that Nancy Pelosi won't like. And then the question is, will Pelosi adjust to that in order to get the Republican Senate to go along? And can these guys get a counterpart going in the Senate? There are a couple of senators who are interested in the same kind of idea. The question will be whether or not we can get these little knots, small groups of bipartisan senators and bipartisan members of the House to work on immigration reform or to work on Obamacare fix or to work on some other individual issue. We've seen that crop up. It has happened over the last 15 or 20 years periodically. They almost got immigration reform. But, you're missing a guy like John McCain out of Arizona, who was a Republican and a staunch Republican, but a moderate Republican, and who, took part in a number of cross-party efforts to get legislation passed. It's going to take that. Now, certainly Biden has a background and an experience over the years of working with Republicans, and Republicans pretty far to the right. Strom Thurmond of South Carolina was a Dixiecrat. And when I remember when Thurmond was chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and Biden was the ranking Democrat before he became the chairman. And they got along pretty well. And I remember asking Thurmond about it. I said, Senator, I don't get it. Joe Biden has said some pretty nice things about you when I went around. I was doing a magazine piece for the New York Times about Strom Thurmond. And I said, Joe Biden has done some pretty nice things for you. He said, wow, Rick? He said, Rick? He said, it's always easier to get things done with honey than it is with vinegar.
Yeah.
So we're going to have to find some honey, and we're going to have to find less vinegar. It's not easy. And Trump is going to make it. Trump is mining the bridges as he's retreating. So you think of a defeated army, and the term is at the end of World War II as they retreated. They were mining bridges, and we were suffering casualties even as we were rolling towards victory. Well, Trump he's seeding landmines all over the place. It's terrible.
So Rick,
It's a real
Rick, let me ask
tragedy.
you another question. And before I do, I want to get our number out again because you're just a first class guest, and our audience really needs to speak with you if they have something on their mind. You can talk to Rick Smith, Pulitzer Prize winning New York Times bureau chief, and a producer at Emmy Award winning producer at PBS. You can speak to him at 707 923 3991.
1-1.
I'm sorry, 923-3911. Rick, I want to ask you, you're a Russian expert. What are our country's enemies thinking when they look at how divisive our politics are? What's Russia thinking? What's China thinking?
Oh, wow. This is just going to be a great time to take advantage of us. I mean, Putin, have to remember, let's go back a little ways. I mean, after the Cold War, under both
Rick,
Clinton and George W. Bush, we declared victory. We said we're going to push the boundaries of NATO right up against Russia. We're going to take it into Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. We're going to take it right into Ukraine. Do you know to Russia, Ukraine is like Canada to us. It's a brother country. We have a caller
that we'd like to get on at this time. I'm sorry to interrupt, but we do have another caller for you. Let's get their question. Caller, go ahead.
Oh, thank you so much. First of all, Rick Smith, I appreciate so much the reference to Toynbee, and probably we all have to go back and read that, and you're just answering the question about possible outside enemies coming into the States. And I wanted to ask you, prompt a question about, defenses here and looking at something like the pandemic as an outside enemy that simply didn't rally us as well. So I'm wondering, how to get across to Americans as a whole the sense of the need to work together. And the first question, and in order to support across the aisle actions. And the second question is, looking ahead, what needs to happen to kind of change the balance for 2022? What would as John said at the introduction, the ground game better than anybody else. What do you think needs to happen?
Well, I would be extremely surprised if Joe Biden, if he is officially confirmed and when he's officially confirmed as a winner, doesn't reach out to a bunch of Republican governors like Mike DeWine in Ohio and some of the others and say, look, we got to beat this pandemic. We got to come up with a strategy. What can we do at the federal level to help you at the state level? What can you do at the state level and the regional level? Can you get you got a Republican governor in Ohio and you got a Democratic governor in Illinois and a Democratic governor in Michigan and a Democratic governor in Wisconsin. Can we get a regional bunch of governors together across party lines? I mean, I think that's Biden's mindset. He certainly has talked that way in the campaign, and I don't think that's campaign rhetoric. I mean, you have to remember, Biden drove some of his colleagues during the Democratic primary crazy by recalling that he had worked with John Stennis and other segregationist Democrats in the Senate. They went nuts. Well, okay, at this point, that background may actually be an asset that he can use. And I will be extremely surprised if he doesn't do that. And I think
Rick, we have about 9 minutes. We got another caller for you. Caller, go ahead with your question.
Hello. Didn't Trump teach us the power of the executive to act without having to cooperate with anybody else? And can't Biden do the same kind of thing?
No, it really didn't work. I mean, take a look at both the economy and the pandemic. It didn't work.
Are you kidding? He deregulated almost every environmental regulation. He stripped the CDC. He did more from the executive branch without any participation in any other form of government than any president ever. Are you kidding me?
Okay, you got your question out. Give me a shot at answering it, okay? You're talking about destructive actions. A leader can create all kinds of destructive action. And it's entirely possible that when Biden comes in, he's going to get a good new environmental guy who's going to reverse all those things. You can do those executive order things, but you can't pass a bailout package to fix the economy without Congress. You can't you can't fix Obamacare without Congress. You can't do immigration reform without Congress. You can't change the ratio of military spending to safety net programs without Congress. You couldn't legally build the wall. I mean, the president defied Congress. Congress voted against him on authorizing funds for the wall. No, there is a certain amount that a president can do, but you can't do the positive things you need to do to move the country forward.
Thank you, Rick. I wanted you, we've had you on the program in the past speaking about the electoral vote and the popular vote. When I last checked, Biden had the majority of the popular vote, and the electoral vote obviously is not decided. Could you speak to gerrymandering real briefly, and also voter suppression that went on in some places in our country?
Well, the voter suppression problem is a terrible problem, and it's in a whole bunch of states, and it's usually done with things like requiring a photo ID in a place like Texas. If you have a hunting license or a gun license, then that qualifies you to register to vote. But if you have a student ID from the University of Texas, it doesn't. So that's manifestly unfair. In North Dakota, for example, your ID has to have your street address on it. So if you happen to be a member of a tribe, and there are a bunch of tribes in North Dakota, they don't typically have street addresses. So their tribal ID, which is an official ID, but like a government ID, it doesn't work to register to vote. So that's a simple way to keep it down. Another way to keep it down is not to have, if you need a driver's license, don't have driver's license qualifying stations in various counties all over the black part of Alabama and Mississippi. I mean, there are all kinds of tricks in the game, and that's a serious problem, and we got to deal with it. Although I will say that the massive turnout in this election is encouraging. There obviously there were a lot of, we don't know how many million yet, new voters that were added to the rolls. So that at least is encouraging. We're moving in the right direction. Gerrymandering is a huge problem, but one of the things we're going to see in 2021 is that there was gerrymander reform in about 8 or 9 states in the last 4 or 5 years. In fact, in 2018, there was gerrymander reform in 5 states. That is going to change the composition of the Congress moving forward, starting with the election of 2022. Michigan, Ohio, Colorado, Utah, Missouri just reversed it. Just terrible. It was a terrible vote in Missouri. They brought in gerrymander reform in 2018 in Missouri, and they called it Clean Missouri to try to make it nonpartisan. And the legislature put a measure on the ballot in this election, and believe it or not, it carried by a small majority, but it carried. So they wiped out the gerrymander reform there. The gerrymander reform is not about shifting seats from one party to the other. It's about making elections competitive. And when elections are competitive, then every vote counts and people will get engaged. It's about making the democracy more open. And there's gerrymander reform now in about 15 or 16 states, and it will make a difference in the Congress that we elect during the 2020s as opposed to the Congress we've had from 2012 until now. That's very important.
Rick, we have about 3.5 minutes, and I do want people to be steered toward your blogging and your website. In the last few minutes, could you tell our folks about what you hope to achieve through that and how they might get in touch?
Well, my website is called reclaimtheamericandreamorg. I wrote a book that came out in 2012 called Who Stole the American Dream, which is about the growth of economic inequality and the political dysfunctionalism in our country that grew over the last 30 or 40 years. And when I got done with it, I was giving speeches. People were asking me questions, how do we fix this? And I began to doing research on that, and I put it on a website, and I've been putting more stuff on the website all the time. You can go there, and you can see stuff about Fighting Citizens United, voters' rights, gerrymander reform, public funding of campaigns, minimum wage, student debt, and it's nationwide. I mean, it's state by state. You can see what's been going on, the court battles, the votes, and that kind of stuff. And it's just there. It's a cafeteria. It's I worked for the New York Times for 26 years. It's run like a news outlet. It's not pushing one thing or another, although I'm deeply interested and believe in the need for reforms to make democracy, fair, more transparent, more inclusive. And I have a YouTube channel called The People versus the politicians. I did a documentary that PBS ran twice this past year called The Democracy Rebellion. It's about democracy reforms, and it's outing dark money in California. It's fighting Citizen Night in Washington State. It's public funding in Connecticut. It's voter ID laws and voter suppression in North Carolina. It's gerrymander reform in Florida. There's a slew of I think, very good and interesting material, and I try to make it dynamic and lively so younger people will be interested in it. Happily, we've had about 1.5 million visitors to the YouTube channel and several 100,000 to the website. So, it seems to be working. And I invite anybody to come. Please join us. And I got interested in it because after finishing the book, I had painted such a dire picture of the state of the U.S. economically and politically that my wife and my editor said, you got to write a positive chapter. What do we do about this? How do we fix this stuff? And I said, I'm a journalist. I report on what is. I'm not a reformer. And they said, well, you got to do something. So that's how I got into it. I got into it trying to answer the question, what do we do about this? And they're not my ideas. They're ideas of other people. I'm the reporter reporting on what they've done. But I have to tell you, what citizen reformers have done in this country is really impressive. This election was a bad election for citizen reformers. There were a bunch of things on the ballot, and everything got beaten except one thing in Colorado to try to overturn the Electoral College. But elsewhere, it wasn't good. But 2018 was the best year for political reform in America in half a century. So I think we're going to be back at it at 2022. I think people understand that there's something wrong with the system. It's broken, and the politicians aren't going to fix it. We have to do it ourselves.
Rick, we have to, our time has run out. We have to say goodbye, but I'd like to have you on for a full hour. I have so much more I want to ask. Really, from my perspective, having worked in national security, again, I want that answer to that question. What are our enemies thinking now as we're so divisive in our body politic and also in government?
One thing China is they think Russia, we can't be counted on. We're not dependable. And number two, they can take advantage of us because we're hobbled internally. Our supply lines are long. Our division is acute. And it makes it very hard for us to move as a nation.
Rick, your knowledge is wide and deep, but it's more than knowledge. You bring real wisdom to your commentary. Rick, I thank you so much for being a guest on our show again, and I look forward to having you back.
And don't forget
yeah, great, John. I'm sorry. I thought we were starting right now instead of a half an hour ago. I apologize.
That's okay. It happens sometimes. Thank you so much, and everyone support KMUD Community Radio.